Hey everyone, welcome to Mountain Beast Mysteries. Tales of Sasquatch go back thousands of years, and the most interesting tales are the ones that occurred prior to the 1967 Patterson footage. Sasquatch was much more of a mystery back then, even more of a mystery than it is now, which is kind of crazy to think about. The wilds were more untamed, more unexplored back in the day, and there were a lot of strange stories and strange legends of encounters with these beings, these creatures, these wild men of the woods. And the stories from back in the day, I'm telling you, were way more insane, a lot more crazier, a lot more wild than the ones we hear nowadays. Nowadays encounter reports are pretty tame. People will bump into these things in the wilderness when they're out hiking or camping. They'll have a glimpse of one of these things briefly. Maybe something will walk up to their tent and harass them a little bit. But the stories of the past are strange. A lot of tales of people being taken, being kidnapped and held captive. Stories of people being attacked. They're just a lot more intense. And in today's video, I have some really interesting Sasquatch stories, legends from the past that I wanted to share with you guys. I have 3 of them. So without further ado, let's get into these tales. I was walking home one day many years ago carrying a big bundle of cedar roots and thinking of the young brave Quallac I was soon to marry. Suddenly at a place where the bush grew close and thick beside the trail, a long arm shot out and a big hairy hand was pressed over my mouth. Then I was suddenly lifted up into the arms of a young Sasquatch. I was terrified, fought and struggled with all of my might. In those days I was strong, but it was no good. The Wildman was as powerful as a young bear. Holding me easily under one arm, with his other hand he smeared tree gum over my eyes, sticking them shut so I could not see where he was taking me. He then lifted me to his shoulder and started to run. He ran on and on for a long time, up and down hills, through thick brush, across many streams, never stopping to rest. Once he had to swim a river, and then perhaps I could have gotten away, but I was so afraid of being drowned that I held on tightly with my arms around his neck. Although I was frightened, I could not but admire his easy breathing, his great strength and speed of foot. After reaching the other side of the river, he began to climb and climb. The air became very cold. I could not see, but I guessed that we were close to the top of a mountain. At last the Sasquatch stopped hurrying. Then he stooped over and moved slowly, as if feeling his way along a tunnel. He laid me down very gently, and I heard people talking in a strange tongue I could not understand. The young giant next wiped the sticky tree gum from my eyelids, and I was able to look around me. I sat up and saw that I was in a great big cave. The floor was covered with animal skins, soft to touch and better preserved than the way we were preserving them. A small fire in the middle of the floor gave all the light there was. As my eyes became accustomed to the gloom, I saw that besides the young giant who had brought me to the cave, there were 2 other wild people, a man and a woman. To me, a young girl, they seemed very old, but they were active and friendly, and I later learned that they were the parents of the young Sasquatch who had stolen me. When they all came over to look at me, I cried and asked them to let me go. They just smiled and shook their heads. From then on, I was kept a close prisoner. Not once would they let me go out of the cave. Always one of them stayed with me when the other 2 were away. They fed me well on roots, fish, and meat. After I learned a few words of their tongue, which is not unlike the Douglas dialect, I asked the young giant how he caught and killed the deer, mountain goats, and sheep that were often brought into the cave. He smiled, opening and closing his big hairy hands. I guess that he just laid in wait, and when the animal got close enough, he leaped, caught it, and choked it to death. He was certainly big enough and quick enough and strong enough to do so. When I had been in the cave for about a year, I began to feel very sick and weak and could not eat much. I told this to the young Sasquatch and pleaded with him to take me back to my own people. At first he got very angry, as did his father and mother, but I kept on pleading with them, telling them that I wished to see my own people again before I died. I was really ill, and I suppose they could see that for themselves, because one day after I cried for a long time, the young Sasquatch went outside and returned with a leaf full of tree gum. With this he stuck down my eyelids as he had done before. Then he again lifted me to his big shoulder. The return journey was like a very bad dream, for I was lightheaded and in much pain. When we recrossed the wide river, I was almost swept away. I was too weak to cling to the young Sasquatch, but he held me with one big hand and swam with the other. close to my home, he put me down and gently removed the tree gum from my eyelids. When he saw that I could see again, he shook his head sadly, pointed to my house, and then turned back into the forest. My people were all wildly excited when I had stumbled back into the house, for they had long ago given me up as dead. But I was too sick and too weak to talk. I just managed to crawl into bed, and that night I gave birth to a child. The little one lived only a few hours, for which I have always been thankful. I hope that never again I shall see a Sasquatch. My grandfather was born in Upper California country near the mountain called Shasta. This was the year of 1853. He fought in the Modoc Indian War in defense of his homeland. However, it was the same old story, defeat and being sent to a reservation. Grandfather did not like the white man's reservation, however, and soon returned to part of the country that he loved. It was by some very good luck and with the help of a white friend in Eureka, California, he was able to buy some land near Tula Lake up in the mountains. He then built a cabin there and lived there from then on until his death. He died in 1935. He fell asleep on a riverbank and never awakened again. Grandfather lived a long and eventful life, but not always a happy one. He told me this story as a child, and I never tired of hearing it. His first contact with a Sasquatch was one evening in the summer of 1897. He was walking along a deer trail near a lake just about at dusk when he saw something ahead, something that looked like a tall bush. Upon coming a little closer, he became aware of a strong odor, sort of musky. He then gave a close look at the bush and suddenly realized that it was not a bush at all, for it was covered from head to toe with thick, coarse hair, much like horsehair. He took a step closer, but the creature made a sound that sounded like Nia. Grandfather knew this was the man of the mountain the old ones spoke about, a Sasquatch. Although it was growing darker, Grandfather was able to see quite clearly two soft brown eyes through the hairy head part. Then the creature moved slightly, and Grandfather made a motion of friendship and laid down the string of fish that he'd been carrying. The creature evidently understood this, as it quickly snatched up the fish and struck out through the timber nearby. It stopped only for a moment and made a sound that my father never forgot, a long "agoom." Grandfather never told anyone outside the family the story. He referred to them as people called Matakagmi. It was only a few weeks after his encounter with the Matakagmi that he was awakened one morning by some strange noises outside his cabin. Upon investigating, he found a sack of deer skins, fresh and ready for tanning. Off in the distance, he heard the strange sound once again, "agoom." After this, there were other items left from time to time, such as wood for fuel, acorns, wild berries, and fruits. It was a few years later that Grandfather had his second but far more amazing contact with the Sasquatch. Grandfather had taken a job with some white men from the San Francisco area to help them search for some treasure, gold, that was supposed to be on Mount Shasta in California. Now, Grandfather never cared much for money, but times had changed for the Indian and living off the land was a little harder now. However, these men had a map of some kind and were bound that they would find the gold in question, so Grandfather agreed to act as a guide for them. However, he could scarcely conceal the fact that he thought all the whites were a little crazy that searched for this yellow metal. Even though they assured Grandfather that if they found the gold he would be a rich man, this made little or no difference to him. After the treasure party had reached the foot of Mount Shasta, the whites began drinking a lot, so Grandfather told them that he would go ahead and explore some of the lower level rock shelves, as they were in no condition to do so themselves. Soon that morning, he set out on a mountain trail, and after quite a bit of rough climbing, he reached a shelf that he wished to examine. Then it happened. A timber rattler struck him in the leg. Grandfather killed the snake and started to come back down to a more comfortable spot, but soon found it difficult to go on walking, and as best as he can remember, he became sick at his stomach and fainted. When he came around again, he thought he was dreaming, for 3 large Matakagmi about 8 to 10 feet tall surrounded him. He noted that they had made a small cut on the snake bite and had somehow removed some of the venom, and they placed cool moss over the bite. Then one of the Matakagmi made a kind of grunting sound, and the two lifted him up and took him down a trail that he did not know. Finally, after some little descent down the mountainside, they placed him under a low, brushy tree and left. Again, Grandfather heard their mournful cry, "agoom." After a long while, he began to feel better and then took his old .44 caliber cap and ball pistol and began to fire some shots into the air. Finally, the gold party found him. Grandfather said nothing about what had happened concerning the Matakagmi. He was taken back to where the pack mules were tied, and then on to the nearest little town where he rested for a few days and then returned to Tula Lake. Grandfather told only his immediate family about this encounter, and after this would never take anyone for any amount of money to the Mount Shasta region. He would only say, "Matakagmi live, that holy place, I have friends there." For many years after, in the still of the evening or sometimes late at night, he would still hear the sound he now knew, "Agoom," the call of the Matakagmi. Grandfather went on to relate that the Matakagmi were not vicious, but were very shy, especially of the white man, and they generally only came out in the evenings and at night. They lived chiefly on roots they dug and berries, and only ate meat in the bitterest of cold weather. Their homes are deep mountainside burrows, unknown to man. I never tired of these stories that my grandfather told me as a boy, and he said they were true, and I believed him. May his spirit always know peace. It was a lovely day. The clear waters of the creek shimmered in the bright sunshine and reflected the wild surroundings of cliff, trees, and vagrant cloud. A languid breeze wafted across the rocky gullies. Frank's canoe was gliding like a happy vision along the mountain stream. The Indian was busy hooking one fish after another. Hungry fish that had been liberated only a few days before from some hatchery. But the Indian was happy he pulled them in and sang his medicine song. Then without warning, a rock was hurled from the shelving slope above, falling with a fearful splash within a few feet of his canoe, almost swamping the frail craft. Startled out of his skin, Frank glanced upward, and to his amazement beheld a weird-looking creature covered with hair leaping from rock to rock down the wild declivity with the agility of a mountain goat. Frank recognized the hairy creature instantly. It was a Sasquatch. He knew it was one of the giants. He had met them on several occasions in past years, once on his own doorstep, but those were a timid sort and not unruly like the gent he was now facing. Frank called upon his medicine powers, Sula, and similar spirits to protect him. There was an immediate response to his appeal. The air throbbed and some huge boulders slid down the rocky mountainside, making a noise like the crack of doom. This was to frighten away the Sasquatch, but the giant was not to be frightened by falling rocks. Instead, he hurried down the declivity, carrying a great stone, probably weighing a ton or more, under his great hairy arm, which Frank guessed, just a rough guess, was at least 2 yards in length. Reaching a point of vantage, a jutting ledge that hung far out over the water, he hurled it with all his might, this time missing the canoe by a narrow margin, filling it with water and drenching the poor frightened occupant with a cloud of spray. Some idea of the size of the boulder may be gained from the fact that its huge bulk blocked the channel. Later, Jack Penny dredged it out on the authority of the Department of Hinterland Navigation. It may now be seen on the 10th floor of the Vancouver Public Museum in the Department of Curious Rocks. When you're in Vancouver, drop into the museum and the curator will gladly show it to you. The giant now posed upon the other ledge in an attitude of wild majesty, as if it were a monarch of these foreboding haunts, shaking a colossal fist at the great medicine man, who sat awestruck and shuddering in the canoe, which he was trying to bail out with his shoe. The Indian saw that the Sasquatch was in a towering rage, a passion that caused the great man to exude a repugnant odor. It was carried down to the canoe with a wisp of wind. The smell made Frank dizzy, and his eyes began to smart and pop. Frank never smelt anything in his whole medicine career like it. It was more repelling than the stench of moccasin oil gone rotten. Indeed, it was so nasty that the fish quitted the pools and nooks and headed in schools for the Harrison River. The Indian, believing the giant was about to dive into the water and attack him, cast off his fishing lines and paddled away as fast as he was able.